My name's Gavin Clark, and I'm with the National Museum of Computing. And it's my pleasure to welcome you and tonight to meet Jonathan Swinton, who is, of course, author of the book Alan Turing's Manchester. His book was published by History Press, and I encourage you to check it out. It's available through our own museum shop as well, online and in person. So I encourage you to grab a copy. Alan Turing's Manchester is an interesting question. We think we know a lot about Alan Turing, I suppose. If you mention one thing about cryptography and Bletchley Park and artificial intelligence and computers, you say Alan Turing, a lot of people go, "Oh yeah, I've heard of him." But Jonathan's book takes a slightly different angle, which is why we were interested in having him come on this evening and talk about his book. He kind of covers the Alan Turing after Bletchley and after the kind of lesson, I guess, the forgotten chapter of MPL in London. Jonathan did he did a maths PhD, which he says a long time ago, and he adopted Manchester in 2002. He says he's been writing and talking about Alan Turing for years now, and apparently he claims to have been a stand-up comic as well, I believe, before he did his first full-length
No,
book.
I did stand-up comedy. That I discovered that's a very different thing to being stand-up comic.
I'm gonna hand over to Jonathan in a second, and he's gonna just chat to us for about 45 minutes. Obviously, please bring us any questions you've got waiting to be answered. We'll keep those to the end. If you want to put them in chat, that's great. Stack them up there, or you can pop them at the end.
Great, thank you very much, Kevin. So this is a book that I wrote 5 years or so ago, and as is implied by what Gavin said, I'm not a professional historian by background. This is a book I wrote because it didn't exist really, and I wanted to know some of the answers. I had some questions that I hoped I'd find answers to, and mostly I didn't. But the way I'm kind of structuring this talk is about two different histories that I found of Alan Turing's life in Manchester, and I think it's quite interesting and quite important that those two histories have sort of coexisted not very happily for a while, and they're still slightly in conflict, I think. And that's illustrated by these two blue plaques. These are on the same building in Manchester, in the university area, just off Oxford Road. And the plaque on the left, of course, commemorates Alan Turing, and the university described him as a creator of computer science, code breaker, and mathematician. And as Gavin hinted at, we're going to see a bit of Bletchley Park. I'm not going to talk anything about his time as a code breaker. And then the other plaque is to Freddie Williams and Tom Kilburn, who, according to the university, and correctly, were the creators of the first stored program computer. Now, you can see from these photos that actually the Williams and Kilburn plaque is a little bit older. It's a bit more faded. What you can't see from this photo is that you cannot actually see these two plaques at the same time. Although they more or less commemorate the same historical events, and they're affixed to the same building in which those events played out, they're on opposite sides of the building. You can't see one from the other. And as a convenient mnemonic, the Turing plaque faces south, whereas the Williams and Kilburn plaque faces north. And that's the first of the binaries that we'll see occasionally in this talk, the north and south binary. I'm not suggesting that the university placed them there deliberately, as one previous listener to this talk thought, but they are different. And although they're only maybe 30 meters apart from each other physically, it takes you 5 minutes to get from one to the other. And that's a sign that there are two different stories going on here. Just mention as we go past that Williams and Kilburn are both described as graduates of the University of Manchester. So that's true of Freddie Williams. He was an undergraduate in Manchester. It's not strictly true of Tom Kilburn. He was actually a graduate of the University of Cambridge in mathematics. He did a PhD at Manchester, so he was a PhD graduate of Manchester. But you can see here that sort of leaching of influence and heritage that universities are very fond of, and Manchester is certainly not out in the front of. So let's address these two stories, and let's start with actually the older of the stories of Williams and Kilburn, and how it was that they came to create what's called here the first store program computer in this building in Manchester. Why did it happen in Manchester? Well, the core reason is that Manchester is at the heart of industrial innovation throughout the 19th and certainly the beginning of the 20th century. Cotton has given way to the industrial infrastructure it enabled, particularly steam, trains, the car is becoming important in this mid 1930s map. What's not on this map is Gavin asked me to talk about the ley lines of Manchester. And actually, in the 1930s, the ley lines are being laid out because the national grid is being set up. Industry is becoming electrified. And Manchester is the centre of a large electrical industry. You have to build transformers and power lines, and generating sets. And there are large companies, Westinghouse, Metropolitan Vickers, in Manchester who are doing that, particularly at a site called Trafford Park, on the outskirts of Manchester. And not for the first time, universities come sniffing around to see if there's technology that they can use happening in industry. And this is the first sighting we'll see of a man who's actually kind of behind a lot of this talk, which is Patrick Blackett. So Patrick Blackett, I've not seen Oppenheimer, but I believe he actually has a cameo role in it, because he was a physicist in Cambridge before he was, this is a cutting from 1934, before he was a professor of physics in London. And he was the physicist that Oppenheimer allegedly attempted to poison with an apple by injecting it with cyanide. It might reflect, given what happened later, that story could quite possibly have gone on circulating in the Cambridge Cavendish laboratory for some years after it happened in the early 1930s to when Turing arrived a couple of years later. But why is Blackett in this newspaper cutting? Well, because he's gone out to Trafford Park to use the technology that Metro Vix have developed to create giant magnets. He's interested in cosmic rays. You need giant magnets for the detection apparatus. So there's a traffic from industry into the university. Quite soon after this, Blackett is actually appointed professor of mathematics, a professor of physics, I should say, in Manchester. So Blackett is also in place in Manchester. And when the war comes, clearly Manchester suffers, or Mancunians suffer as much as anyone else does, but economically, the city thrives on war. In a really effective example of state intervention, there's a long planned strategy to convert British industrial production to wartime purposes, and the Metro Vic factory in Trafford Park, among other things, contributes to churning out 1,000 Lancaster bombers during the course of the war. So Manchester at the end of the war is not actually what I kind of imagined when I started researching this book. It's not a broken city at all. It's an optimistic city. It's a relatively wealthy city. It's a city envisaging helicopters and streamlined buses across the Irwell. We never quite got those, despite Andy Burnham's promises. But so it's an optimistic time. And another component of the electrical industry, Ferranti is a big firm making switchgear, and it has a sideline building radios before the war. It's got a radio line in which you have women sitting at a conveyor belt assembling pre-war radio sets supervised by male engineers in white coats. And the same process happens at Ferranti, that production is taken over and devoted to the production of radar sets to defend those thousands of bombers. And this is an Ethel Gabain lithograph that you can find in Manchester Art Gallery, where this woman is making, with this extraordinary tenderness, a cathode ray tube. So pre-war television, just about on the electronics horizon, that technology is adopted and taken up for the use of radar. So we've got electricity, we've got electronics. One of the other things that Manchester has a substantial, a national, and in a sense, world-leading position at during the Second World War is numerical computation, pre-electronic computation. This is a model of a differential analyzer, an analog computer that I think probably this audience knows very well, that a man called Douglas Hartree, who became the professor of mathematics in Cambridge, made to persuade the university to buy him a bigger one. Might point out that this model is now in the stocks of the Science Museum, which allegedly is also a National Museum of Computing, but this Manchester-built and Manchester-purposed model is actually in the Science Museum in London, not the one in Manchester, but we can decolonize that later, possibly. So we've got electronics, we've got computing, and we've got productivity. And one of the signs that I'm not a professional historian is that I kind of never really focused on the fact that the past happened in color rather than black and white, like all the photographs were of. So it's quite hard to track down color photographs of Manchester from this period. In fact, this is from the 1960s, but it shows quite nicely a thing that everybody commented on, and I sort of digress a fair bit about in the book, is the blackness of the buildings. This is, I think, relevant to how people like Turing would have experienced moving from Cambridge to London. There is filth here, but it's not how we would currently see a dirty building. It's not neglect, it's wealth. This is the coal dust that is powering the mills and the buses and the trains and and warming the homes and paying for the jobs. So Manchester is a dirty city, but a proud one and a productive one and a relatively wealthy one. So Williams, who we saw on the plaque, very explicitly said, I'm not a mathematician. And he wrote in the 1970s that someone explained to him that we needed a storage system, and the cathode ray tube storage system was the outcome. I'll show you a picture in a minute. And he moved to Manchester when he had managed to develop a technology that could store one binary digit. And there's another quote he gave about, because he was recruited to Manchester by Patrick Blackett, quite probably, to build a computer in Manchester. How did he know about computers? Well, he learnt about them from people who already knew about them. This is another quote from Freddie Williams. Tom Kilburn and I knew nothing about computers. Newman and Turing did. They took us by the hand and explained how numbers could live in houses with addresses, which sounds like a sort of Turing kind of metaphor, but who knows who actually came up with it. But the key point is that Williams very clearly saw himself as someone who was developing, in fact, the memory, and had explained to him the need for computers and the visualization that other people had of how they were going to work. But for whoever explained what to who, the outcome was a major technological triumph. So this is a reconstruction, which you can see in the Hall of the Science Museum in Manchester, of the machine that was set up and started running in the summer of 1948, before Turing arrived in Manchester, and on which I think pretty much there are lots of firsts that you can argue about in computing, but it's reasonable to say that the first program in the modern sense ran on this machine in the summer of 1948. Just mention in passing, partly because it's from my new book, a quote from a cybernetician, a guy called Warren McCulloch over in the United States, who came to visit Manchester, I think in 1949, because people were already aware of something remarkable was happening here. I spent a day with Turing and Jones in Manchester. So not Williams and Kilburn, not the engineers who actually put this machine together. They use a tube that looks like a cathode ray on which they write the things to be remembered as so many jots or places for jots, call them tittles, arranged in columns and rows. So the cathode ray tube was the device that Williams really rather brilliantly invented. This was the first practical computer memory. It scaled, it dominated, it was the best technology for probably 8 or 9 years. But what no one had, of course, was a name for what bits were. We'd say bits and bytes now, but if McCulloch had his way, we'd be talking about how many gigatitles our computers had. So that prototype and the baby that we were seeing was a prototype designed to show computer memory, developed over the next few years, thanks with funding, extensive funding from the British government, subsidizing Ferranti to build this slick streamlined 1950s machine. Here's Tom Kilburn leaning over the console where the Ferranti engineers are showing off this machine. And that machine, we've got a color picture of it here. That machine became the first machine, probably first computer to be sold anywhere in the world, and started off a line of technological or commercial technological innovation that kept on going for several decades, but did then peter out rather. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, this is a post-war university from the air. We know it's a post-war university. The building where, so the Turing plaque is currently on this side of the building, and the Williams and Kilburn plaque, can you see my arrows? I hope. The Williams and Kilburn plaque is here. Up here on the other side of the road is a post-war building. You can tell it's post-war because it doesn't have the grime on it, which was the very first building the university was funded to build. I think possibly any university was funded to build after the war, which was electrical engineering, a building built specifically to exploit the Williams and Kilburn's engineering technology into a new discipline. This was to be the home of the computer. And in some ways, it was very successful. One of the lines of computers that came from there, I'm sure some of the people on this call will recall it, was the Atlas, which was briefly the fastest computer in the world. So successful technologically, but not very successful commercially. The Atlas, I think, sold 2.5 copies. And by the you can date the decline of the homegrown British computer industry to wherever you like, but that line of hardware innovation had really run into the sand well before the end of the 20th century. Now, I'm not for a moment saying that was to do with any failure of leadership in Williams and Kilburn. You can argue about all sorts of reasons for that. For what it's worth, in my opinion, it was the Americans who were pouring billions of dollars into anti-ballistic missile technology that drove fast electronic computing, and that military-industrial complex funding the British were never going to be able to compete with. But for whatever reason, Britain stopped being a place where mainframe computers were built. So success for some decades and then failure. And I give versions of this talk. I have given versions of this talk to several kind of collections of veteran computer engineers, and they kind of ruefully, perhaps sometimes, will accept that. But then I find often haven't really thought about the other things that could have happened in Manchester but didn't. So Manchester is not the place where the computer mouse was invented. Right? It's not the place where ALGOL or Pascal or object-oriented programming or neural nets or machine learning were invented. Manchester has never really been a world-leading centre in software innovation. It trains lots of very good quality software engineers, but whatever lead might have been established from that early innovation never quite took off. And that seems to me quite an interesting and important question. Why not? And one of the questions I kind of ask at the Science Museum is they show the baby, but they don't really ever say, well, what happened to it? What happened to British computing? And this is a good time to mention a speech that Freddie Williams, the more senior of the engineers, made towards the end of his career. We had a very successful career. We're kind of at the heart of the British establishment as far as an engineer can get. And he gave this talk. It's jocular, but it's kind of bitter as well. The engineers inevitably associated with trade. The public at large in this country have not yet fully set aside their traditional aristocratic attitude that to be really tops, 2 things are required. A, one must be supremely good at something. B, the something at which one is supremely good must be absolutely useless. So why is he saying that, and why is he so cross? And who is he talking about? Well, I think he's talking about mathematicians, and I think he's observing that it's the mathematicians who mainly populate the Royal Society, not the engineers. And this business of aristocratic gets us thinking about class a bit. So I'll just park that for a minute and talk about Tom Kilburn. He's a younger generation. more meritocratic, maybe. By the 1960s, he's become professor. He lives unpretentiously in Urmston. Here's the atlas, which is going to be 3 million times faster than the human brain. When Kilburn is asked about the origin of the computing, he doesn't say what Williams said, which was Turing and Newman told us. He says, between 1945 and 1947, somehow or other, I knew what a digital computer was. Where I got that knowledge from, I've no idea. Now, it's a historically attested fact that he went to lectures on electronic computing, some of which were given by Alan Turing. Right? We know that's true because he thought they were rubbish lectures. But nevertheless, the writing out of this contribution is quite strange. And it's not a deliberate attempt to take credit away. It's a reflection of the fact that Kilburn came in as a young man, more or less unaware of the precedents that caused the funding to happen in Manchester, and was running with the engineering paradigm, and not, to an extent, the software paradigm, I'd say. So that reaches its apotheosis. If you know Manchester, you know this building squatting on the Oxford Road, this kind of monastery-like building of the 1980s called the Kilburn Building. And inside the Kilburn Building, you'll find the records of what that department wanted to say about itself, what it wanted to tell students and visitors who came into the building. If you go in there now, pretty much ever since Benedict Cumberbatch played Alan Turing, you'll see lots of stuff about Alan Turing. But if you went in a few years before that, you would see Williams and Kilburn and a few of the other pioneers and brilliantly inventive engineers recorded. 4 of these men, we see their faces, they're identifiable figures. And then there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 other people, 5 or 6 of whom are women with short skirts. But we don't know who they are, we don't know their names, they're not recorded. So this story has already written out some women, and there's no Turing here. So what's going on? There is one tiny little reference to Turing in that sort of 2010s history, which said, at first, programs on the Ferranti Mark I that we saw the picture of were written in binary using an ingenious but daunting system devised by Alan Turing, who came to Manchester in October 48. The programmer effectively worked in a 32-base number system. So it's giving credit to Turing for some software innovations, but dressing it up as ingenious but daunting, difficult, abstract maths. It's not a million miles away from saying supremely good at something useless, this sort of base 32. Why would you do that when you could have decimal? Well, you do it because that's actually a more efficient computing system. So Turing is mentioned on the very extreme sidelines, but not as the mainstream of the story. Okay, so I've been talking for almost half an hour, so time for the advert break, because I'm not actually being paid to give this talk. So I'll repeat what Gavin said, that this book, which covers many of these topics slightly more coherently, and a few topics that we haven't talked about, is available at the National Museum of Computing.org shop. But what I suggest you do right now is type into your browser manturing.net, and that will take you to my webpage where you can get the links to the blog and the Twitter feed, which is mainly not about Turing, and all of those kind of things. Okay, so we return to our normal programming and talk about the other story, a story that only kind of mathematical logicians really knew about up until the 1980s when Andrew Hodges' book came out, and which didn't hit the public consciousness until the play in the 80s, Breaking the Code, and crucially, Hollywood film a few years ago. So let's talk about Alan Turing. Alan Turing is not a Manchester man. He's unlike Kilburn, who went to grammar school. Turing went to a public school, fairly minor public school. He went to Cambridge in the 1930s. This is the Cambridge of the Apostles. He was kind of probably, it's unclear quite how close he came to being one of the Apostles, a sort of secret society of, at the time it was a secret society of very attractive young men and slightly creepy older dons. But he wasn't an apostle. He was nevertheless part of a culture where homosexuality was tolerated is kept discreet. But more relevantly for this talk, I just mentioned that Patrick Blackett was there in the thing, but the person we actually want to talk about is Max Newman. So Max Newman was a maths lecturer when Turing was a graduate student, and during Turing's first graduate year, Max Newman gave a lecture about the new mathematical logic, almost closer to philosophy, that was coming out of Germany at the time. And Max Newman explained a problem by a great German mathematician called Hilbert. And that problem was, how do we know the limits of mathematics? What are the things we know that we will be able to prove and the things that we'll never be able to prove? And you may think that's a completely pointless question. And most mathematicians to this day, in some ways, including me, still think that's a rather pointless question. But it turned out not to be. It turned out to be a question worth asking, because at the end of the seminar, everybody stood up and filed away silently, as people do at the end of the seminars. And a year later, one of the students comes back and hands a sheaf of papers to Max Newman and says, "Here is the answer to your question, Dr. Newman." And of course, that student was Alan Turing. And the sheaf of papers was this paper on computable numbers, which came out in 1936. Now, I'm not going to go through this, obviously, because as Turing says, the consistency is clear from the meaning. So we don't need to talk about the details. They're all too obvious. But I will just very briefly situate this in the history of computer science. What Turing did in this paper was conceive of a machine that we can now, with hindsight, logically identify with a really good theoretical model of what a computer is. And with foresight, as you might imagine, in 1936, it did create the opportunity to think this is how we could make a mechanical thinking machine. There were very, very few people in the world, perhaps only Turing, or Turing and Newman, or Turing and Newman and von Neumann over in America, who could see how the mathematical logic had that implication. But what this paper does not have, as you can tell, it doesn't have blueprints, it doesn't have specifications, it doesn't say how many bits of RAM this machine needs to have. The answer is an infinite number for a Turing machine. But it does define this thing called the Turing machine. And by the 1960s, when the computer science discipline is getting going and needs authority, they go back to this paper in 1936 and say, this is the founding paper of our discipline. And to this day, computer science students are taught about this paper, if not taught the paper itself. So this is a founding paper in the theory of computer science. But that's not really the reason why Turing has an influence on what happens in Manchester. It's more through Bletchley Park, because all of this thinking stops in 1939, and Turing is famously one of a list of men of the professor type, as they said at the Treasury, who were paid to go off to Bletchley Park to start code-breaking duties. And a year or two later, Max Newman joins them after persuasion from, yes, Patrick Blackett. And Patrick Blackett and Max Newman is the man, of course, who, in collaboration with an electrical engineer, Tom Flowers, creates the Colossus, which you've got I don't know if the Colossus replica is actually working now, or it's kind of half there, or there's something to look at anyway. Now, the Colossus is seen, I think, now by a consensus of computer historians as fairly squarely in the line leading to modern electronic computing. One of the reasons for that is input-output is done through electromechanical sensing of holes in paper tape, and that's technology that's come from Patrick Blackett's lab in cosmic rays. But the central reason is that they discovered, kind of after they'd built this machine, that it could be logically reprogrammed without hardware re-engineering it. So the idea of an instantiation of this Turing machine, that software could change what the hardware did. The Colossus is one of the first places where you get this instance. And that's the line, that's another line that leads us to the baby. So we don't have any documentary evidence of exactly why it was that the Royal Society decided in 1946 to give £35,000, vast amount of money in post-war Britain, to Max Newman, not to Williams and Kilburn, but to Max Newman, to start a computing laboratory. But I think it's a reasonable assumption that those at the top of British science, including Patrick Blackett, saw that here were war-winning machines of enormous potential power, and that it was worth investing in them, and investing in them through the mathematicians working in collaboration with, and I think probably initially expecting giving directions to the electrical engineers. Now that was a process that fell apart very rapidly. One reason was that Newman wasn't interested at all in the practicalities of computing, unlike Turing is very interested in tinkering. And so Williams and Kilburn very quickly took over both intellectual leadership of the project and in some sense moral leadership. But Newman remained what we'd call the principal investigator quite late on. As late as December 1948, it's Newman who's meeting with the it's a diary entry here of Max Newman's when he's meeting with effectively the chief scientific advisor to the government, so Angela McLean in current terms. He's going to play with the Royal Society £35,000, and here's the sign that Newman is in there as a power player. They will find a little steel. Steel is the currency of power in post-war Britain. Every single ton of steel is being prioritized by the government to rebuilding factories, and yet they're finding some steel to build a new building to house the prototypes that are becoming the Ferranti Mark I. And so that's why we find Turing eventually standing at the console of the Ferranti machine. He's recruited by Newman to Manchester, not to design the computer. I mean, there is still, I think, a historical debate, which I'm not that interested in, about exactly what hardware and software contributions Turing did made to these early generations of computing. I think my impression is it's rather more than the conventional Manchester histories, but it doesn't really matter. The crucial point is he's meant to invent the role of software, and particularly you get with Ferranti, you have the problem, how do we sell these new machines? Nobody knows what they are. They're very expensive. How do we tell people what they're for? And software actually is a marketing device for selling these machines. Software is going to be able to do these things. And that's why in later years, you get things like chess playing programs and God Save the Queen and all of these things happening on the computer, showing people what they can do, thinking with the computer. So that's another line leading to the baby. Was that a question? But Turing's role in that, if it was ever succeeding, and in some ways he never really had a leadership role in that laboratory. I've lost the map. That's what I'm missing. But then we get to the most notorious and tragic part of Turing's story. So in December 1951, he walks into this police station in Wilmslow. The reason there's a picture of this police station in colour is because of bus enthusiasts. So they've got a huge catalogues of colour pictures of buses, which just happen to have Wilmslow Police Station in the background. So thanks to bus collectors. He walks into this police station and to report a theft. And for reasons that nobody quite knows, he includes in the description of this theft that he's having sexual relationships with a male 17-year-old, I think we could say boy, who's a friend of the person he thinks is doing the theft. And as a consequence, both he and the boy are arraigned at Knutsford Quarter Sessions. The boy is seen as the victim in some sense of an older predatory man, and he's more or less let off. Turing is sent on probation, and it's a condition of his probation that he has to go and visit a psychiatrist. That's all we actually know about what happens medically to him. But an outcome is he takes estrogen, which suppresses his libido. That's finished by the end of 1952. And 2 years after that, he's found dead in Wilmslow at the age of 41. So I'm not going to talk about that aspect of his life, which in some ways is the most important, certainly in his public perception and as a driver for Andrew Hodges' brilliant book. But just mention a couple of things about this obituary. At the time of his death, what was his contribution? He was responsible for the mechanical brains. He he invented two features for the calculating machines, which added immensely to their memory and range. So at the time of his death, I mean, this is obviously a journalistically garbled version of something that was explained to them. But at the time, Turing was seen as a hardware innovator, in part, completely washes away after his death. Now, when I saw Andrew Hodges give a talk about this 20 years ago, two things happened. First of all, he gave me a really interesting set of binaries that I've been sort of thinking about ever since. He mentions two of Turing's assistants' writing software, Cicely Popplewell and Audrey Bites. This setup, he said, neatly confirmed Manchester stereotypes. I think this is still on his website, this distinction. Hard and soft, engineering and mathematics, Kilburn and Turing, things and concepts, north and south, real Manchester and virtual Womanchester. And, you know, the language of sexuality and gender politics has moved on a little bit from then. And I don't know how much Andrew would push this. I think probably not too much. But lurking behind this binary is a suggestion that one of the problems on the Oxford Road, one of the things that stopped Turing making his full potential or connecting well enough, was that he was seen as a soft Southern mathematician poofter. And obviously, no one ever wrote that down. But equally, no one ever wrote down that they saw the opposite. And one of the reasons I wanted to write the book was to explore how the university really did respond to Turing, particularly after his public shaming as a sex offender. And actually, it was in some ways much more tolerant than you'd expect. He actually had his contract renewed after he was prosecuted for having sex with a 17-year-old. Max Newman stood up at his trial and said, "I am a friend of Alan Turing." It helped that GCHQ sent along someone to speak in secret session, I believe, on his behalf. But Kilburn and Turing are remembered as not getting on. And I think one of the things to think about in terms of that is, well, sexuality is in the mix, engineering is in the mix, dirty and clean is in the mix, dirty hands and clean hands, soft and hard. I think class is in the mix as well. As I said, Kilburn was at Cambridge, but not in one of the posh colleges. So there are degrees of class which are impenetrable to anyone outside the English class system, or possibly anyone who hasn't been to Cambridge, but those degrees are definitely there. So just quickly bounce through a couple of the other binaries that I talk about in more detail in the book. This is a publicity photo from the time that Ferranti are trying to sell these used machines of a woman who we think is probably a photographic model, not one of the software writers, who Ferranti were recruiting female software writers in large numbers at this time. And what's this woman doing? She's knitting. Why is she knitting? She's knitting because, why is she doing this activity? Because Ferranti are trying to sell the idea that this new machine will take your work away from you. So she's got some work to do. She's given it to the computer and she's sitting back while it hums and whirs and she's waiting for the answer to come back. And while she waits, she gets on with her stereotypical leisure activity. There's another photo from the same shoot with a different model who's doing embroidery. This obscures the fact that women were actually working in Ferranti in quite large numbers, and it was only later that they got pushed out of software writing, but that's a whole other talk, another book. This is one of the women, Audrey Bates, we saw mentioned earlier. She went off to Toronto, where a clone of the computer, the Mark I, went as part of Canada's computing. And this is a photo from a few years later where she's supervising what's effectively the first use of remote computation. So someone in Ottawa or Toronto or somewhere is typing in into teletype a problem, and that's being fed direct to the Toronto computer. This is labeled in the archives of the university where Audrey Bates worked for decades as, she's labeled as teletype operator, which she is, but she's also probably the most expert person on software programming in Toronto, in Canada that year. But just mention her briefly. Oh, while we talk about binaries, class is quite an issue. I think it's perhaps worth reflecting on the fact that Turing was quite snobby. I mean, he was very attracted to working class young men in particular. That seems to be the case. But he was very aware that working classes were different to him. How to mix with the lower classes, he wrote, seems to me worth knowing, but even supposing one had found a lot about it, it might be difficult to write on the subject without hurting the poor dear's feelings. Perhaps one would have to rely on their not reading it. So there's class dynamics going on as well. And Turing is a child of the Raj, he's an imperial child. He's not going to go down well in middle-class grammar school Manchester. But nevertheless, they both have offices in that building built with Max Newman's little bits of steel. Turing and Kilburn, two adjacent offices. And it's worth thinking, I think, a bit, just check on the time, about what could have happened if they could have collaborated more. Could Britain's really early lead in thinking about software, or software about thinking, could that have run further than it as it turned out it did? I don't think we'll ever know. What I do know is what happened when this building opened. This is just across the plaza in Manchester from the Kilburn building, the old computer science building. This was built around the 2000s as the new maths building. And the mathematicians, who were never very good at branding, didn't think until almost the last minute what they were going to call their new building. And at the last minute, someone said, we could call it Turing. And they went, oh, yeah, that's probably quite a good idea. Very wise. But the head of the department, quite an experienced university player, as it were, thought he better not upset the computer science department. So he went and had a quiet word with the computer science department. Said, we're going to name our new building Turing department. Turing building, do you mind? And the answer came back, no, we don't mind. We're not going to name anything after Turing. And then this quote, which is a secondhand quote, I can't source it, but the quote was, if Turing had lived longer, he would have set the cause of computer science back by decades. Now, so they're talking about someone who was the founder, who is in the books as the founder of computer science. Why is that happening? It's because of a distinction in people's heads between engineering as what computer science is and what's useful, and mathematics as what computer science is and what's useful. And that's still a live argument and a live debate. I think the history of Manchester computing shows that mathematicians have got a role. Don't let them take charge. But nevertheless, it remains a contested history. And these difficult tensions of class, of sex, of gender, I haven't mentioned race because there's very little evidence to go on, but these tensions contribute to those disciplinary contentions. Now, when Gavin asked me to give this talk, he said, do you think you could tease out a bit more of the social story and maybe talk about Manchester and Cambridge, compare the role of government, computing practice and research culture, the technology ley lines of Manchester? You asked me to talk about individuals, companies, research, Ferranti, women in programming, how visible that was in Manchester. What was it that attracted a young, gifted gay man like Turing? And what was it like for Turing in the city? How was he seen? Can we learn about him from how he's seen by others? How important was his work? How did he feel about Manchester? How did he fit in? And a topic I haven't talked about. And what's the difference between urban Manchester, ancient Cambridge, and suburban Wilmslow in terms of how the Home Office treats issues of sexual deviancy? So, Gavin, I will happily talk about all of those things in my next 6 or 12 talks. But for now, I'm just going to say, if you're interested in any of those, ask a question about it, or look in the book, because those were questions that they weren't how I started the book, but they were the kinds of questions I discovered we needed some idea about, and I made an effort to find out about in Alan Turing's Manchester. Which again, you can find a link to how to buy it at manturing.net or through the National Museum of Computing's website. You can follow me on Twitter. My most recent tweet is danger, do not enter, void within. So you can make your own mind up about that. Or you can, if you've got any questions, I'm sure somebody will dive in with some, but do feel free to email me at jonathan@swintons.net. Okay, time to stop.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. It was fantastic. Very gripping stuff. I learned a few things there as well. I'm interested in this kind of rivalry, this ongoing debate between engineering versus mathematics, and how it became the latent history of it out there in Manchester, and how it kind of contributed to this, I suppose, it's tension, because I guess people outside will see computing as, in many ways, one thing, and everyone working towards a common goal. But I guess we kind of forget there's these kind of academic or intellectual rivalries between it, kind of us and them, the tribal aspect to it, isn't there?
There absolutely is. And I mean, computing is about thinking and doing at the same time. And, the very idea of software engineering is a completely 20th century concept. So if you said to an engineer, you're going to engineer this, but you don't need overalls, that really would have confused them. And one of the things that really plays out, I think, is around gender. That the physical operation of that Manchester Mark I was seen as man's, or of the differential analyzer actually was seen as men's work. You wore overalls to do it, and it was greasy. But actually, the best person operating it was a woman. So the rise of early computing really upset people's gender assumptions.
That's a good question. I was just going to, just to remind everyone, if you've got a question, please just pop something on the chat function, and we can get it over to Jonathan. I mentioned, I picked up on this earlier from something you said as well about the large number of women that Ferranti employed. I mean, we know from our sort of social history that women had a large role in computing in the 1930s even, and so on. And they kind of like were eliminated, were faded away as computing progressed. How and where is Ferranti employing them? What were they kind of working
on? Simon Lavington has really done some really great work on this. So there was a thing called the tin shed, I think it was called, on part of the Ferranti factory where they worked. You can see in the Ferranti newsletters and places like that how that sort of developed as a workplace where people didn't quite know where to put these women. They weren't, they weren't working class women who might equally well be in the mills. And there's a fantastic episode by Mary Berners-Lee. Well, she wasn't called Mary Berners-Lee at the time, who went on to be the mother of Tim Berners-Lee. And she had done a master's degree, I think, in Birmingham, and came up for an interview at Ferranti as a new software programmer, not really knowing what that job title was. And she got off the train at Piccadilly and took the bus up the Oldham Road. And she remembered thinking when she was on the bus, she wrote, "I will never, ever, ever come to this ugly place." And she got to Ferranti, and they had an interview, and they explained what the job was. And she thought it was so exciting, so full of potential and interest, that she took the job and became a skillful and quite well-known programmer for years, and indeed gave us Tim Berners-Lee. So that story, which, as I say, Simon Lavington has done a lot to flesh out about the women who were there, is an interesting story. And I think there's probably some more stories to be told.
Do we know, just interested, does anybody else have a question of their own? Because I've got a few more, but I don't want to take away time from anybody else. Have you got, if anyone wants to pop a question into the chat, or if you want to raise your hand there on... Okay, we've got something from Bernardo. I wonder if, Jonathan, could you talk more about the friendship Turing developed with Lynn Irvin, Max Newman's wife? Do you know much about that?
Yes, I'm looking at the questions now, so I'll just take them in order. So, Jackie, I think you know the answer to your question. I hugely enjoyed researching this book, and I got addicted to archive research as a consequence, hence another book coming. And then this business about hierarchy of different disciplines. I mean, hierarchy in whose head? There was a memory that the engineers thought that the mathematicians looked down on them, and that feeds into this general thing. So I think people kind of had a clear idea of what the hierarchy was, whether they thought it was really justified or that they were indifferent. The hierarchy at the maths firm was a different one about, whether people get the job done is a different thing. But in terms of academic prestige, I think it was fairly clear. So Bernardo's question. So yeah, thank you, Bernardo. That's a very good question, because Lynn kind of saved this book, really. Turing, as I say, I really needed to go into, I didn't use that many primary sources, but I needed to find a few. And Max Newman, who, as we've seen, is really crucial to this story, he's terrible as a letter writer, in the sense he says, "Dear, coming on the 10:30 train." That's it. Alan Turing's a little bit better. His letters are quite lively, and you get a sense of his mood and what he's experiencing and which boys he fancies. But the person who really opened Manchester up for me in this period, and particularly the life of an academic wife married to a professor in South Manchester at the time, was the woman who's married to Max Newman, called Lynn Irvin. And her letters are kept alongside Max's in St. John's, and I really recommend her as a good read. She wrote a few books. She was a literary journalist, kind of knew Virginia Woolf and people before this period. Yeah, she's a really good source, and I think people should know more about her and Max, actually. Lynn Irvin, Max Newman, and Patrick Blackett are all, I think, underwritten about figures in terms of their role in the thought dynamics. I mean, perhaps one of the things that Lynn is valuable for as a documentarian is, when Alan Turing used to go around to Max's, I think, kind of to get fed quite a lot, and they would sit in the back garden, Max and Alan, not Lynn, she's making the tea, talking about what they're going to do with the new computer. And she hears their conversation, Alan with his nervous giggling laugh saying, we're going to teach it, and we'll take the little ones for walks in the park, and we'll teach it to tell jokes and write sonnets, and maybe fall in love, and all sorts of ideas which kind of later on get formalized in the Turing test and the mind papers and these relatively famous discussions that happen in Manchester about mind and the machine. She's the first person kind of in the world, really, to hear those things as a layperson, and she really, really doesn't like it. She really doesn't like the idea that a machine is going to have some kind of consciousness and that you're going to have to listen to its jokes, and it really disturbs her. And she's kind of the first bystander we have in how everybody else gets to experience computing. I gave her slightly more of a starring role in the book than is entirely justified by the technical developments of computing in Manchester, but I think she's really interesting in how she viewed what was going on. She did say at one point about Max Newman, who she thought was terribly clever and charming and funny, but why she said, does he devote his life to things so essentially boring? But I'm glad he did. Richard, you had another question about production engineering. Yeah, I mean, clearly there are hierarchies of kind of textbookiness, and academicness of degrees, which often reflect socioeconomic standard and status and don't necessarily reflect value or skill. And engineering and math, or mechanical engineering versus production engineering, are places like that, I guess. First of all, slightly less self-advertisingly, one of the reasons I wrote this book was, or reason I got into writing about Alan Turing at all, was that by trade, I am, or used to be, a mathematical biologist, which was just one of the fields that Alan Turing, we didn't quite invent, but no one else did more of the inventing of it than anyone else did, than he did. So mathematical biology was my thing. And I've done a bit of work about what Turing was what he actually came to Manchester for, what he did when he had time on the computer. That, so incredibly valuable that nobody else in the world realized it was valuable. So he stood up all night and he's running computer code. What does he do? He's not doing cryptography. He's not doing mathematical logic. He's not doing any of the things that he's famous for. He's working on problems in mathematical biology. So I do have a book out now, which is also advertised on my website, or you can buy it, actually, think through my website, about the mathematical biology that Alan Turing was interested in. In a sense, I'd recommend it for everyone because it's got lots of lovely pictures of sunflowers and daisies, but it is, to be honest, a graduate level text in mathematics. So I wouldn't, it won't be a test on that. And then I have a new book coming out about a figure who didn't know Turing, although she did know Patrick Blackett, and was a friend of Lynn Irvin, and she's a psychologist called Molly Harrower, and that's coming out from University of Akron Press next year, but I'm going to wait until that's available before I push that anymore. Richard, was Wilmslow a more leafy, less polluted area as quite away from the university? How did he travel into the university? That's a good question, Richard. So when Turing first came to Manchester, he lived a couple of streets away from where Max Newman lived, which is in fact a couple of streets away from where I'm talking now. And that's one of the reasons why I thought, oh, when I realized that Max Newman actually lived around the corner from me, I thought, Jonathan, you really do have to write this book. So originally he roomed with a landlady in a semi in Hale, which is still then and now quite a posh suburb of Manchester, enabled by the railway. But when he got wealthy, and he did become wealthy partly from enormous consultancy fees from Ferranti. One of the reasons for thinking actually that Turing had quite a bigger contribution to Manchester computing than you might think is that he, alongside Williams and Kilburn, were getting huge wadges of money from Ferranti personally for developing the machine for them. And Turing got that too. So when he felt wealthy, he went and bought a house in Wilmslow. And Andrew Hodges has suggested that's partly for privacy, so his landlady did not approve of the young men visiting. And so Wilmslow was a bit more private and certainly greener, also on the railway line to Manchester. And he usually cycled into Manchester, and then he'd get to Manchester and there'd all be that palaver with, cycle clips and rain capes and shillings and stuff like that. In the office, he shared with Audrey Bates and Cicely Popplewell and didn't really think they should be there. So he'd do that, but occasionally he would run. I think it's 12 miles. One of the other things about Turing was that he very nearly made it into the British Olympic team as a marathon runner, but there's a whole other story. Right, but the crucial thing about Wilmslow, or as it were, the more serious story about, and I think perhaps it's a clue as to why he made this extraordinary admission, is that when he moved from Cambridge to Manchester, and I sort of highlighted how Cambridge was a place where it was possible to be not overtly gay, but to be known as homosexual. The University of Manchester probably wasn't like that, but as we saw, it actually, accepted Turing when he was publicly outed. But Wilmslow was not central Manchester. Manchester was the Oxford Road where the university is a pleasure district. There's cinemas, there's sailors, GIs, there's prostitution, male and female, there's drag shows. All of these things are happening in central Manchester in the 1940s, and the police, have to police that and turn a blind eye to whatever they choose to turn a blind eye to. That's not the case in suburban Wilmslow, and it might have been that Turing really badly miscalculated the differences between Manchester policing and Wilmslow policing, but he certainly really miscalculated something. So thank you for that question, because that lets me bang on about something that I wanted to remember to mention.
Just keeping an eye on time, I think, do we have any more questions from anybody else? Time for one final question.
Yeah, that's another very good question, Richard. No, it didn't. Ferranti, well, the famous letter that came. I mentioned the diary entry of the chief scientific advisor coming to visit Newman and get a demonstration of the machine. And I think it's the same visit, or maybe a few months later, and they see the working prototype. They see this brilliant electronic innovation that Williams has perfected of memory, and they basically write a blank check. So this letter goes to Ferranti saying, build a machine to the design of Professor Williams, not to Turing or Newman, to the design of Professor Newman, and we will pay what it costs plus a bit. So that, I don't know if they quite invented it, but they're absolutely in the center of this kind of cost plus sense of defense procurement, which persists like a cancer for 40, 50, well, it's still going now, really. And Ferranti, for decades, profited from this model. So the government spent a great deal of money with them developing missile systems into the 50s and 60s and 70s, I guess. And that was eventually where Ferranti went to. I think they moved out of electrical stuff. Oh, thank you very much, Gavin. That's the link.
Yeah. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt your flow there, Jonathan. I was just getting that in before people logged off. I was going to chuck that in at the end, but I thought people would just very log off and it'll go. But
yeah, I mean, that's a good point, Richard, about, how do you manage a wartime economy? Lynn Irvin, I should say, was also a friend of Keynes, and Keynes, I think, knew and probably fancied Alan Turing and Blackett. Keynes knew Blackett, he didn't fancy Blackett, I think. So they were all kind of sitting in this pre-war world in Cambridge of thinking that it would be much better if scientists ran the economy, because they're rational. Scientists in the 1930s, there was large numbers of them who became what were known at the time as fellow travelers, so close to communism or communist party themselves. Turing himself briefly flirted with the kind of idea of at least international cooperation or Popular Front, whatever. And Blackett remained on the left all the way through the war. By the time he gets to the end of the war, he knows about Britain's atom bomb developments. He's not on the core secret committees, but he knows what's going on. And of course, he's a nuclear physicist. And he actually comes out against the atom bomb post-war. And this really infuriates Churchill. And Churchill asked for a security report on him, or actually, there was the general paranoia about atom spies and whatever created security reports. So we know quite a lot about Blackett from his MI5 reports. And he was on a list of what was called pinko scientists. And that list of pinko scientists included 12 scientists, one of whom it's possible had been passing information, although not secrets, to the Russians, but the rest of them hadn't. MI5 completely missed the actual atom bomb spies, who were all humanities scholars, to the extent they were Cambridge, but not scientists. Sorry, there's a whole bunch of, as you say, there's another book or 3 in there that someone should write.
Definitely should. Okay, I look forward to somebody writing that one. Listen, it's been great having you. I'm glad you can make it. You could join us this evening, Jonathan. And if everyone would mind, just, I don't know, virtual claps or little team calls.
Thank you very much, particularly Richard. Thank you. Those some very good questions.
Yeah, some good questions there. Thank you.
And you too, Bernardo.
Show your appreciation. Be much appreciated. Thank you very much, Jonathan. Great, and hopefully we can have you back at some point in the future to delve into this in all kinds of other ways. But in the meantime, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure having you.
Great, thank you for the platform. I love talking about this stuff, and
thank you, Richard.
Enjoyed it. Right,
thank you. Bye bye. Bye, everyone.
Have a good night.